Hello and welcome back to Comparative Vertebrate Anatomy. And today we're going to be talking about the muscular system. And you probably already know quite a lot about muscles and the way that they work just because you've been in athletics or PE, health classes, things like that. But what we want to do today is just an overview of the structure and function, and then the different kinds of tissues that you're going to see and the different kinds of muscles and what they do. Okay, so as far as muscles, there are a lot of them, and the body actually has more than 600 muscles, okay? And that can range from very, very tiny, like the muscles in your eyes that help focus the lens, to really large muscles like your pectoral muscles or your gluteal muscles, things like that. So what does the muscular system do exactly? We think about it in terms of movement, yeah, or posture. But it does a lot of other things too, and one of them is to protect your internal organs. Your rib cage, for instance, does a great job protecting your lungs and your heart, but your digestive organs don't have that bony cage around them. They don't have the skull like bony plates that your brain has. And so what they do have though is your abdominal muscles, and those are thicker for a number of reasons. One, you need them to walk, and two, you need them for posture. But they also act to protect those organs. They're that first barrier, and they protect a lot of internal organs that way. They also are going to be those involuntary movements that we don't think about: the pumping of blood, the digesting of food, the breathing, right? Waste being moved through and out of the body. They're going to open and close body openings, and I think you know where we're going with that because we've talked about digestion, things like that. The other thing that they do that people really don't think about, but it will be so obvious, is that they produce heat. When you're cold, you shiver. It's because those large muscle movements generate heat that help maintain your temperature. Okay, so movement. When we think about movement, can you think of some movements that you perform without actually thinking about them? It's your turn. Okay, well, you probably came up with things like breathing, your heart beating, digestion, right? And then what about things that you do have to think about? Oh, anything, actually. Picking up a pencil, talking, walking, running. Sometimes you're not, well, all the time, you think about what you want to do, and then the muscles will move to make that happen. But it's still what we call voluntary, right? And so there are two muscle categories. The first one we talked about would be the involuntary. These are the things that happen whether you think about them or not, because it would be bad if you had to think about breathing or think about your heart beating. I think all of us would die pretty much early on. And then the voluntary, of course, are considered under conscious control. Okay. Now, there are also three types of muscles. Okay. And those come in the smooth muscle type. Okay? And so cardiac muscle and then skeletal muscle. Okay? This is going to be smooth muscle. This is cardiac muscle. And the cool thing about these is you can see you've got these lovely striations here, and here you have these nice nuclei. You can see all the nuclei, but then you have these attachments between these pieces, and so they're actually quite complex in terms of the cells. And then the ones we think of most are going to be the muscle cells, skeletal muscle, skeletal muscle, and that's what we're going to be concentrating on in this conversation. But I do want to make sure that you understand what everything else is. The visceral muscle is the smooth muscle. The real name for it is visceral, and that is because it's with the organs. It's going to be involuntary. That means it's controlled by the autonomic part of the nervous system. It's smooth because it has no striations. Okay, and so when you think about muscle, that's kind of what you think about. But it lines various organs, right? Makes up the walls of all of the blood vessels, and it's found in the tubes of the digestive system. So cardiac muscle is the next one, and I think it's obvious where this one is. It is found only in the heart. It is striated like the skeletal muscles, but like smooth muscles, it's also involuntary and under the control of the autonomic nervous system. And it has specialized cells that provide a stimulus for contractions. And we will talk more about heart and the heart muscle and how it beats later on. So that will come up again. Okay? Now, again, we're going to focus today on movement and skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle is going to be the majority of all of the muscles in your body. And the cells are what we call multinucleate, and you can see that there are multiple nuclei in each cell, so that's kind of exciting. They are striated. You can see this beautiful visible banding pattern. And as you're looking at muscle, but in specimens, or if you're just thinking about, say, having a steak or a piece of chicken, you can actually see this tissue, right, as you're looking at these whole pieces of muscle, because that's what we eat for meat, is muscle, skeletal muscle. Okay, it is voluntary, which means you're thinking about it. And then the cells are actually surrounded by and bundled by connective tissue. And again, you can see that too. That's that kind of white lining that you have on top of and in between the striated fibers. Okay, now continuing on. All right, so skeletal muscles are going to have three parts, right? There's the origin, and that's the end of the muscle, and it's attached to the less movable part of the bone by tendons. There's the insertion, and that's at the other end of the muscle, and that's going to be the more movable part, right? And it's also attached by tendons. And then you have the action or body, and that's the thick middle part of the muscle. So if you're to look at any of these things, and you can actually see origin, insertion, and then the body. But here's some terms that I want you to know. Muscle, it's made of bundles. Bundles are muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are made of myofibrils, right? Myofibrils are made of filaments, right? Those are the long, thin strings. There are thick filaments. Those are made of myosin protein. There are thin filaments. Those are made of actin protein. And it's the combination of thin and thick that actually give it that striated look, okay? So when you put this all together, right, you get this picture that looks something like this. And so here is the large muscle, okay? And you can see that there are these bundles here, and those are bundles of fiber. And then here is the muscle fiber, okay? And then there's a nucleus and all that good stuff. Then that's a bundle too, right, of fibers, of myofibrils, right? And you can see those. And then the myofibril have the thick filaments and the thin filaments of the myosin and the actin, and this is all protein. So usually when we're talking about eating protein, a lot of times that's what we're thinking of, is building muscle, and muscle is all protein for the most part. Of course, we've talked about that you need protein for a whole lot of other reasons too, but this is in terms of the muscle. And then the myofibril is divided into categories, like various pieces, and the large units are called sarcomeres, and then there are Z-lines, and that is, the functional unit is the sarcomere. It's a section of myofibril, which is what we just talked about. And then here's a picture, okay? And so the sarcomere is this segment in between what are called these Z lines, okay? And so the contraction is going to happen as the myosin and the actin move over each other. And so like here, these will close together, and that's a contraction, and they relax, and then they move together again, and then they relax. And that's done by another protein, okay? And then just here's another picture. And this is the actual muscle. You can see this is an actual photo. Here's the Z line, this is the sarcomere, and then again, you're going to have the thin filaments sliding together over the thick filaments to make that contraction, right? And a contraction is really an all or none kind of event, okay? So you either have those thin filaments sliding over the thick filament, or you don't, right? So the question really is, how do you get different levels of contraction? So how much force do you have, like when you grab your hand, grasp your hands? In your skeletal muscle, not all fibers are stimulated every single time, and that's going to be what's going to regulate the different responses. And so different combinations, different numbers, things like that. And that's what gives you what's called a graded response. And so that allows you to have different amounts of movement, different amounts of force in that movement. Okay. Now, all of these movements are controlled by nerves, and so you have to have a nerve stimulus that goes to the muscle. And we'll talk a little bit about the nervous system later on, but skeletal muscles, it's got to be contact, right? So there's a contact here, and then that stimulates the nerve to contract. And these are called motor units, and a motor unit consists of one neuron, which is a nerve cell, and the muscle cells that are stimulated by that neuron. Okay, so we're talking about the muscle response to stimuli because you have either the autonomic stimulus, which you're not thinking about, or the stimulus that you are thinking about. And again, muscle force depends on the numbers of fibers that are stimulated, and more fibers means more tension, right? And more tension means more force. And muscles can continue to contract until they run out of energy, right? And we've had that if you've been exercising. Muscle fatigue is that sort of thing. Okay, so when we look at the contractions themselves, here's the origin, and this is what we're talking about in terms of the less movable bone, right? And so this is not moving in relation to the forearm. So the upper arm is not moving in relation to the forearm. So this is the humerus, right? And then this is the ulna that you've got going on here. And so you're going to have this insertion point is going to be the point at which you are moving, and you can see that this is a nice longer tendon. But anyway, so that's the contraction. And it's a lever, which is kind of cool, right? And so this would be you've got this motion, right, of the lever, and so here's the lever arm, and then this is the weight that you're lifting, and here's the rotation point, and here's the fulcrum, and that's all really cool, actually. So tendons, we've talked about this a little bit, right? So I just want to review tendons, and you can see that the tendons are actually really cool. They're a type of connective tissue, and they're white and stringy. They're a little bit like that packing tape that has the strings in it, that clear packing tape that is really hard to get through. You actually have to cut it. Having said that, tendons do tear, and they do tear off of the bone, and some of you may have had injuries like that in the past. But you can see lots and lots of tendons, and so these toes are actually going to be working because of these muscles up here higher in the foot and in the ankle. Okay, so back to the body movements. This is just to review. I just want to make sure that you understand, now that we've talked about the contraction, that you can visualize the origin and the insertion point, okay? And that you understand that these have to have opposing pairs, because if you raise your arm, you're going to have to be able to lower it as well. And you don't want it to just fall under under gravity, right? Because that's not going to work out very well. There's not a lot of control in that. And so you need to have a muscle that would move the arm up, and then you need to have a muscle that will move the arm back down. And in your arm, it's going to be the biceps and the triceps, right? So remember that muscles only contract and relax. They can't push. They can only pull. Okay, so other types of movements, those are all the nice voluntary that you think of, but you also have muscle twitches, okay, and that's a quick jerky contraction of a whole muscle from a stimulus, and so you get that kind of like, twitch, actually. Fibrillation is where the muscles are contracting, but it's not coordinated, so you get different fibers at different times, and it's inappropriate. It's not the right kinds of contraction. And this is what you see actually when you're watching TV shows, and they'll have somebody who is in the emergency room. A lot of the doctor shows will have this, and they'll show you the heart monitor, and it's got the little wavy parts. It's up and down, and they're like, oh, he's tacky, blah, blah, blah. That's fibrillation, when the heart is actually just kind of lots of twitches together, right? And then convulsions are where you have contractions of large groups of muscles, but it's inappropriate. It's at an abnormal time or inappropriate time. And then you have spasms, and these are contractions that you have no control over, but it's a relax, contract, and so it's involuntary, sudden, and for a fairly long period of time. Okay. Now, we do like the exercise, right? So aerobics mean that you're exercising in the presence of oxygen, right? So you've got oxygen to your muscles. This is going to result in stronger muscles, and you have an increase in blood supply. The muscle fibers will increase mitochondria and oxygen storage, and the muscle becomes less likely to fatigue because you have this system that's going to supply more oxygen, which is very nice. And so it doesn't increase the skeletal muscle size, though. So aerobic really just kind of makes the muscle more resilient, right? But it doesn't actually increase size. In order to increase size, you would want to have resistance training, and some of this is aerobic and some of it, well, it's anaerobic, actually, a lot of it's anaerobic. But the way that you get increased muscles is from resistance training. What you do is you focus on the contractile filaments and the connective tissue so they increase, and so you're just lifting, you know, or pushing or pulling or whatever, and that's actually what's going to increase your muscle size and your muscle strength. Okay, now, muscle strength does not depend on the number of fibers that you have, and that's an important thing. We're all born with all the fibers that we have, right? So you're not going to get more fibers, yeah? But you can change the thickness of the fibers, and the strength will depend on how many contract at one time. Okay, so just make sure that we understand that. Now, what about getting sore after exercise? And if you're really, really sore, this is called DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness. And this is because you end up working out or pushing your muscles beyond the point where they have oxygen. They basically run out of energy. And so if you work out moderately, you have enough oxygen to make these work and change glucose into ATP through respiration and you know, provide enough energy. But, right, if you do work out rigorously, right, if you kind of overdo it, you use up the oxygen that is in your blood and your muscles keep working. But at this point, they have to switch to this anaerobic fermentation, which the byproduct is lactic acid. And then lactic acid is going to build up in the muscle cells, and it will pass on into the blood and all this good stuff. But the bottom line is that it can actually cause cramping, and it's what causes that soreness later on, is that buildup of lactic acid. Okay, so things that could go wrong with the muscular system, right? Well, one of the big complaints for people across the board is back pain. We don't have the best back, and so our muscles have to support the spine and the lower back, and it's not the best structural design, but it is. But those muscles tend to get pulled out and weaker, especially as you get older, and so back pain is one of the biggest complaints in terms of muscle pain. And then you get cramps sometimes, and this is a sudden involuntary contraction of a muscle that's so strong it actually causes damage and pain. And then sprain is where you have some sort of traumatic injury, and it could be to tendons or muscles or ligaments, and ligaments are what hold joints together. Okay, and then the other thing is strain, which is not necessarily quite as bad as a sprain. This is where you just have torn or stretched tendons and muscles, and that causes pain too because there's damage there. Okay. Now, other things, right? You could have a contracture. Right? And a contracture is where the muscles will remain contracted and the joint actually loses flexibility and the ligaments and the tendons become shorter because they're not moving anymore, and so they shorten. And then there's pes planus, which is called flat foot or fallen arches. And this has to do, if it's a thing that happens later on, it's because your foot muscles get weak, although it can be something that you're just born with. That's the congenital part. Gangrene is actually a muscle thing, but this is where your muscle becomes infected with a Clostridium bacteria, and they produce huge toxins that kill muscle tissue, and so the muscle actually starts to die off. And then tetanus is something we're probably familiar with. Many of us have had tetanus shots, and that is to prevent lockjaw, which is another bacterial infection. Okay, and then other things, some of the genetic diseases that you can get are going to be muscular dystrophy, right, is one of the big ones. And that's actually a group of genetic diseases that cause atrophy, right? The deterioration of muscle tissue over time. It's mostly painless, but you stop being able to function in terms of moving your muscles. There's also fibromyalgia. And so this is a whole, again, blanket category of muscle disorders that will affect tendons, the muscles, ligaments, and any fibrous tissue. Okay? And then there's myasthenia gravis, which also is probably a genetic thing. But this is a condition where the nerve impulses don't go right to the muscles, and people eventually lose the ability to control various muscles. And it affects the autonomic nervous system too, and so people lose the ability, for instance, like swallowing or peristalsis, and so it's pretty serious. Now, aging is something we're all going to do, okay? And as we age, the amount of connective tissue is going to increase, and the amount of muscle tissue is going to decrease. And so what that means is that the muscles become stringier, and we actually call that sinewy. And the body weight is going to decline, right, because you lose muscle mass. Now, by age 80, muscle strength has usually decreased by about 50%, but you can mitigate some of that decrease simply by weight training through, most of your life, but especially after you get there. Now, that is the end of the muscle conversation. So if you have any questions, please ask them when you get to class next time, and thanks for listening.